All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about securing Active Directory, AD. We're going to be looking at how to improve your organization's security for your Microsoft environments.
Yeah, so this could be on-prem or in the cloud.
Exactly, yeah.
So we're covering the whole gamut, and really kind of the mission of this deep dive is to give you some actual advice that you can use to better understand and secure your AD environment.
Absolutely.
So that's our goal. And we're not going to do that by just like throwing out a bunch of confusing technical jargon.
Right, yeah.
We're really going to try and stick to practical things,
Right.
things that you can implement right away. So we're going to be doing this by going through a couple of transcripts of Sean Metcalf. He does a lot of great work over at Trimarc Security, and he has some great YouTube videos that go into a lot of detail.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal expert in this space.
He is, yeah. So he's someone you should definitely be paying attention to. So I think the first thing to probably talk about is just some of the common issues that we see in a lot of AD environments.
Yeah, what are the things that you see all the time?
Yeah, what are some of the real pain points that you just see over and over again?
Right.
So one of the biggest ones is around password policies, right? Like we might think that a 10-character password is secure.
Yeah, that's reasonable, right? 10 characters.
It's getting there, but it's not enough anymore, right? Because if you think about it, it used to be hard to brute force a 10-character password.
Mm-hmm.
But now with the GPUs that we have and the cracking rigs that people are running, you can chew through those pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if they follow common patterns or are based on word lists.
Yeah.
So we really need to be pushing to 12 characters
Okay.
or more. And that seems to be kind of becoming the new standard.
The new baseline.
Yeah. And the other thing that we see around password policies is sometimes root domains might have weaker policies than child domains.
Okay.
Which is a huge problem because if you can compromise an admin in that root domain, then you can just kind of walk your way down into the child domains, and that's a significant weakness, right?
Yeah, that's your starting point, right? Like
Yeah.
if you can compromise those root domain admins, then you have kind of a good path forward for lateral movement.
You do, yeah. You have a really good stepping stone to the rest of the environment.
Makes sense.
There are some tools out there that are really useful for auditing password strength.
Oh, really? Okay, that's good to know.
What are those?
Yeah. So Mike Raffia, he has a PowerShell tool that's really good.
Mm.
And then there's also Psychotic, which is another tool. Both of these can be used to actually audit passwords against known weaknesses and identify any other problems.
Nice. So you can actually run a tool and be like, okay, let me see how good our passwords really are.
Yep, exactly.
That's good. So what's another common issue you see all the time?
Another very common one is using the default group policies that come with AD.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of times these are just left as is. Right. You know, the defaults are usually good. Right. That's what people think.
You would think so, right?
You would think.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works.
But the problem is the defaults can get changed, whether it's by software installations or just outdated configuration.
Right, right. So stuff happens over time and you're just like, oh, that's what it was, right? And then it's just kind of neglected.
Yeah, and that's how you get into trouble.
Yeah.
Because you really need to actively manage these group policy objects, review them, make sure that they're actually meeting your security needs. Don't assume that the defaults are still okay.
So you're saying that the defaults, you can't just set it and forget it.
Exactly. You got to keep an eye on those.
Got it. So what about seeing what's actually happening in the environment? Are there ways to tell if someone's trying to attack it or do some recon?
Absolutely. And that brings us to domain controller auditing.
Okay.
So a lot of organizations stick with the standard auditing configurations that come out of the box.
Which makes sense. Like, that's the easiest thing to do. Just stick with the defaults, right?
Yeah, that's the path of least resistance. But unfortunately, those defaults don't give you enough detail to really see what's going on.
You're not getting that deep level of insight that you need.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So you need to enable more advanced auditing policies. You can use a tool called Audit Poll, which is a command line tool, to actually go in and configure the auditing settings on your domain controllers. And this lets you track specific security relevant events.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. So you can really get into the nitty gritty, like, oh, let me see who's doing what and what are the real actions taking place.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And, you know, on that topic of auditing, something else to watch out for is the account operators group.
Account operators group, what is that?
Yeah, it's actually a leftover from the days of NT4.
Oh, really? Wow.
Going back in the day.
A relic of the past.
It is, yeah. And you should not be using it for delegation. So Microsoft strongly advises against using this group because it essentially gives a backdoor level of access to a lot of the important objects in your AD environment.
Okay, so do not touch account operators group.
Exactly. If you find anything in it, remove it.
Okay, good advice. So then what about the admin accounts themselves, right? Because I would think those need to be under extra tight control.
You would think so,
Right.
but a lot of times we find that the passwords for critical AD admin accounts are super old.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like we're talking about domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins.
Right, the real top-level privileges.
Yeah, and they might not have been changed for years.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, like one stat that I saw was that the default domain admin password might not have been changed for an average of 14 and a half years.
14 and a half years, that's crazy. Like, why is that happening?
It's crazy, right? So it's either neglected or forgotten about,
Wow.
but it makes those credentials a prime target.
Right.
Because attackers will often try default passwords or just brute force over time.
Makes sense.
So you really got to be careful about that.
Yeah. So I feel like that kind of leads into this whole other conversation about SPNs.
It does, yeah. So if you have regular user accounts or service accounts that are members of groups like domain admins and they have SPNs registered against them, it opens up a huge Kerberoasting risk.
Okay, can you walk me through like how that actually works? How does that actually happen?
Yeah, so attackers can get those SPNs. They can request Kerberos service tickets, and then they can try to crack those tickets offline. And if they're successful, they get the account credentials.
Ah, okay. So basically it's like giving them a pathway into those credentials through the SPN.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's also worth noting, like, if you see a standard user account that has an SPN registered against it, but the SPN seems like it would be used for something like SQL Server, that's usually a red flag.
Yeah, something's not right there.
Yeah, something's misconfigured. So what we really need to do is utilize separate dedicated service accounts and really, really adhere to the principle of least privilege.
Yeah. Okay, so least privilege even applies to service accounts.
It does. You should have separate service accounts for your workstations, for your servers, and for your domain controllers.
Got it. So, okay, I know we were talking about group policies earlier, but there's also a whole discussion about server group policy objects and how they shouldn't be linked to domain controllers.
Yeah, that's another really important thing to watch out for. Don't link group policy objects that are meant for servers to your domain controllers.
Okay.
Because those settings will also be applied to the DCs, and it can have really bad consequences.
Why is that? Like, what happens?
Well, you could accidentally give server admins membership to the AD administrators group.
Oh, so you're giving them way more power than they should have.
Exactly. And then they have administrative control over your whole AD environment. It's a huge risk.
Wow, that's a big one.
Okay. It is, yeah. One of the analogies they used was that someone with the ability to change one of these GPOs, even if they're not a domain admin, could essentially run any code on your domain controllers or change critical group memberships.
Oh, wow. So it's like you're leaving the back door open for someone to just walk in and take over.
It's kind of like that, yeah.
That's really scary.
Yeah.
What other types of misconfigurations do you see out there?
Another big one is inappropriate user rights assignments.
User rights assignment.
Yeah. Like, for instance, domain users shouldn't be able to log on to domain controllers directly.
Okay.
That's just bad practice.
Right. Why would they need that? Yeah.
Yeah. And overly permissive delegation is another problem.
Okay. And that's essentially just giving too much power to people who don't need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You also have to be very careful about the permissions that you're applying to the admin stakeholder object.
Okay. Admin stakeholder, remind me what that is again.
It's basically a template that enforces permissions on your highly privileged accounts. So if you delegate permissions directly to admin SD holder, it can have really wide-ranging security impacts.
Got it. So really got to watch out for who can log onto the domain controllers, who can delegate permissions, and how those permissions are configured, especially on that admin T holder object.
Yep, that's a great summary.
Okay, good. So what about just the way that AD admins work? Does that affect security at all?
Yeah, it definitely does. One thing that we see a lot is AD admins using their regular workstations for administrative tasks.
Okay.
And those workstations usually have a bunch of accounts with local admin rights.
Okay.
So if an attacker can compromise that workstation, they could potentially pivot into the AD environment itself.
Okay. So it's like you're saying, if you have the keys to the most secure vault, you don't want to leave them lying around in a less secure area.
Exactly, yeah.
Got it. Okay, now we got to talk about Kerberos delegation, because this is something that the sources mentioned was a little weird.
It is, yeah.
What's weird about it?
Well, Kerberos delegation is basically a way for one service to impersonate another user to access resources.
Okay.
The problem is the older form of this, which is called unconstrained delegation.
Right. So that's the bad kind.
It is, yeah.
Unconstrained, that doesn't sound good.
It's not. And that's because with unconstrained delegation, the service that's delegating essentially gets the user's granting ticket,
Oh, wow.
and that lets them impersonate the user to any other Kerberos service on the network.
Oh, wow.
So you really need to move away from that.
Get rid of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Constrained delegation is much better because it restricts that impersonation to specific services and servers.
Okay.
And then for your admin accounts, there's a checkbox in their properties that says account is sensitive and cannot be delegated.
Right.
And you should make sure that's checked.
Okay.
And you should also add those admin accounts to the protected users group for extra security.
Okay, so basically we're trying to restrict the ability for things to impersonate each other and get access to things they shouldn't have.
Yeah, we're putting a lot of limits on that.
Right, and we're also making sure that the admin accounts have those extra layers of protection.
We are, yeah.
Okay, good.
And then when you're dealing with multi-forest environments, you got to be careful about cross-forest administration.
Okay.
Because what often happens is, for convenience, people will add a domain admin account from one forest into the admin group in another forest.
Okay, that makes sense. Just trying to simplify things.
Exactly, yeah.
But is that a bad thing?
But the problem is, if that second forest has weaker security, an attacker could compromise that less secure forest, and then they could gain control of the domain admin account from the first forest, putting the whole first forest at risk.
Oh, that's bad.
Yeah. So the best practice here is to create separate, less privileged accounts just for cross-forest administration.
Okay.
That way, you're isolating those privileges and you're reducing the risk.
Makes sense. So what you're saying is isolation and dedicated accounts are really important when you're dealing with multi-forest environments.
There, yeah.
Okay. Now, there was something else we were going to talk about. Unencrypted domain controller storage. What's that all about?
So this is a bit of a scary one.
Okay.
Often the storage on domain controllers isn't encrypted,
Okay.
which means if an attacker gets physical access to the DC or even just to the storage, they can use tools like DS internals to get sensitive information, including password hashes.
Okay.
And they can get this directly from IFM sets.
Okay. IFM sets. What are those?
Install from media sets.
Right. Okay.
These are created when you promote new servers to be domain controllers.
Right.
And the problem is that IFM set has all the AD data, including the domain encryption key.
Oh, so it's like giving them the blueprint to the entire kingdom.
It is, yeah. And it's all stored in the registry hive.
Wow. Okay. So that's a significant vulnerability if that storage isn't encrypted.
It is, yeah. You're essentially giving an attacker everything they need on a silver platter.
Yeah, yikes.
And then there's also this whole thing about manipulating the AD database directly.
Okay, yeah. That was called, I think it's called fun stuff in the sources.
Yeah.
Which doesn't sound fun to me.
Yeah, not fun at all.
Not fun at all.
Not fun at all. So if you stop the AD domain services on a DC, or if the DC is offline and an attacker can access the DIT file, which is the database file, they can make direct changes to the AD database.
Okay.
And these changes might not be visible through the standard management tools or audit logs.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
for example, they could change the primary group ID of an account to 512.
512. What's significant about that?
That's the RID for the domain admins group.
Oh, so they're making someone a domain admin without actually adding them to the domain admin group.
Exactly.
Okay. Sneaky. Very sneaky.
Very sneaky.
Okay.
They could also add SID history without it being logged. And one of the really tricky things is there's a switch in DS internals called skip meta update.
Okay.
And that lets these changes persist on a specific DC without replicating to other DCs and without triggering any auditing.
So you're saying an account could be a domain admin on one DC, but not show up anywhere else.
Exactly, yeah. And it would be very difficult to detect.
That's a nightmare for security monitoring.
It is. It's a big blind spot.
Okay.
And then on top of that, AD admins often don't monitor for unexpected DC restarts, which could be a sign that someone's been messing with things.
Right.
And then finally, it's important to remember that this vulnerability extends to virtualized environments like VMware.
Okay, so even if you're running your DCs in VMware, you still got to worry about this.
You do, because if an attacker compromises the VMware admin accounts, they could potentially take control of those virtual domain controllers.
Okay, so it's like a chain reaction, right? You compromise one thing and it leads to another, and then you've got the whole forest.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah, this is making me really realize that AD is way more complex than a lot of people think.
It is, yeah. It's a very, very complex system.
Okay, so given all these potential weaknesses,
No.
how do you even begin to tell if someone's probing your environment, gathering information for an attack? Like, how do you detect that AD reconnaissance?
So that's a great question.
Yeah.
And one of the key techniques here is to enable object access auditing and specifically look for event ID 4662 in your security logs.
Okay.
And then configure something called SACLs, System Access Control Lists, on sensitive objects like the admin SD holder object and your highly privileged groups.
Okay.
And what this does is it logs who is querying information about those objects,
Okay.
which can be really helpful in detecting tools like Bloodhound and PowerView,
Okay.
which are commonly used by attackers to map out relationships in AD.
Got it. So you're basically setting up an alarm that goes off if someone's snooping around where they shouldn't be.
Exactly.
Okay.
Other things to watch out for are modifications to GPOs. That's event ID 4662 again.
Okay.
And then monitoring access to the sysvol share. That's event ID 4663.
Okay.
So monitoring those events will tell you if someone's changing GPOs or accessing the underlying files in sysvol.
Right.
If you're using LAPS, the local administrator password solution, you can actually audit the password attribute itself using PowerShell CMDlets.
Oh, wow.
And then one of the most important events to monitor is event ID 1102, which indicates that event logs have been cleared.
Oh, so that's like the attacker trying to cover their tracks?
Exactly, yeah.
Let me get rid of all the evidence.
Yep, that's a very common tactic.
Okay. Wow, those are some really good practical things to monitor for. So you've talked a lot about how to detect reconnaissance, but what about breaking it? Like, how do you actually make it harder for attackers to even get that information in the first place?
Yeah, so there are a few things you can do there. One important step is to remove the authenticated users group from the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group.
Okay.
And this limits what standard users can see in AD.
Okay.
You can also create secure admin OUs with restricted visibility.
Secure admin OUs.
Yeah, so basically you're hiding those OUs from authenticated users.
Okay.
So they can't see what's inside them.
Okay, that makes sense.
It makes it harder for tools like PowerView to do their reconnaissance.
Okay.
And then there's something called the list object access mode, which is controlled by the heuristics attribute on AD objects.
Okay, what does that do?
So this lets you effectively cloak AD objects.
Cloak them.
Yeah, make them invisible.
Like completely invisible.
Well, invisible to authenticated users and to tools like Bloodhound.
Wow.
But this one is a little tricky.
Okay.
You have to test it thoroughly in a non-production environment.
Okay.
Because if you don't, you might break legitimate applications or workflows.
Right, because if you make something completely invisible, even the good guys might not be able to see it.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so cloaking is powerful, but use it with caution.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. What else can you do to make reconnaissance harder?
So in newer versions of Windows, like Windows 10 version 1507 and later, standard users can't enumerate the members of the local administrators group by default.
Okay.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, makes sense.
For older systems, implementing host-based firewalls can help.
Okay.
And you can initially run those firewalls in audit mode so you can see what legitimate traffic is happening before you actually block anything.
Okay, so gather some intel before you actually start locking things down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, you can also consider disabling session enumeration using a tool called netcease.
Netcease, okay.
It's a tool from Microsoft Research.
Okay.
And it prevents authenticated users from listing active network sessions on a machine, which is another common reconnaissance technique.
Okay, so you're just making it harder and harder for attackers to get a clear picture of your environment.
Exactly. The more roadblocks you put up, the better.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we talked about all these general things, but the second video we looked at focused on actually doing your own AD security review.
It did, yeah.
Like if you're going to sit down and be like, okay, let me see how secure AD really is, where do you even start?
Yeah, so a good starting point is to review your user accounts. Look for any accounts that have been inactive for a long time.
Okay, and how do you define inactive?
You can look at a combination of password age and last logon time.
Okay.
So if an account hasn't logged on in a while and the password's really old, that's a good sign it's inactive.
Okay.
Other things to look for are accounts with reversible encryption enabled, accounts that have no password set, accounts with passwords that never expire, accounts that are still using DES encryption for Kerberos, accounts that have the do not require Kerberos pre-authentication option set, and accounts that have SID history.
Okay. That's a lot to keep track of.
It is, yeah. But luckily, the Trimarc 80 Shex PowerShell script can help you automate the identification of a lot of these issues.
Okay, nice. So that's one less thing to worry about.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so after you've reviewed user accounts, what's next on the list?
The next thing to look at is your domain password policy.
Okay.
And you really want to pay attention to the minimum password length.
Right.
As we talked about earlier, 12 characters is a good minimum these days.
Right.
Ideally even longer.
Okay.
This helps protect against password spraying and brute force attacks.
Makes sense.
Another important setting is the tombstone lifetime.
Tombstone lifetime. Okay, what is that?
It controls how long deleted objects are retained in AD. And it also affects how long your backups are valid for authoritative restores.
Okay.
You want to make sure it's set to at least 180 days.
Okay.
That's been the default since Windows Server 2003 SP1.
Got it.
You should also be doing regular system state backups on your FSMO role holders.
Okay, those are the special DCs that hold the important roles, remember?
Exactly.
Okay.
And you should be doing these backups at least monthly and keeping them for at least 6 months.
Okay.
And just be aware that creating those IFM sets we talked about earlier can sometimes change the last backup date that some monitoring tools see.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so got to watch out for that.
Yep.
Okay, so Tombstone Lifetime, backups. What about connections to other domains or forests?
Yeah, so that brings us to trust reviews.
Okay.
You need to review all your trust relationships at least once a year,
Okay.
and that's to make sure they're still needed and that they're configured correctly.
Okay.
Bidirectional trusts, those require extra scrutiny.
Okay.
You should also consider whether selective authentication is being used.
Okay. What does that do?
It limits the scope of the trust.
Okay.
So it reduces the potential impact if the trust is compromised. It's also worth noting that credentials can be cached when authentication happens across a trust boundary, which can introduce security risks.
Okay, so trust relationships are something to keep a close eye on.
Yeah.
What about SPNs, the service principal names? How do you review those?
So duplicate SPNs can cause problems.
Okay, what kind of problems?
They can cause Kerberos authentication to fail and force you to fall back to NTLM.
Okay, and NTLM is bad.
NTLM is less secure.
Less secure. Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you actually find those duplicate SPNs?
You can use the sets SPN dash command,
Okay.
and that will help you identify and resolve any duplicate SPNs.
Nice. So that's a specific command to run to find those potential problems.
Exactly.
Okay. So what's another thing that people often miss in their security reviews?
One thing that's often overlooked is group policy preferences, or GPP, and specifically the passwords that might be stored in those GPP XML files.
Okay, so this is kind of going back to that set it and forget it problem that we were talking about earlier.
It is, yeah. So a while ago, Microsoft released a patch to stop people from creating new GPP passwords in a way that was insecure.
Okay.
But if you have older GPOs, those might still contain passwords in those XML files.
Okay.
And those passwords can be extracted relatively easily by attackers.
Okay, so even if you applied the patch, you still need to go back and check for those old passwords.
You do, yeah. You need to identify those older GPOs and either remove those passwords or replace them with more secure alternatives.
Got it. Okay, so it's not just about applying the patch. It's about going back and cleaning up the old mess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk about the really important accounts, the AD admin accounts. What should we be looking at when we're reviewing those?
So for all accounts that have full admin rights in AD, that's domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, anyone who's been delegated equivalent permissions, you need to do a thorough review.
Okay.
Make sure they have strong, unique passwords,
Yeah.
and that those passwords are changed regularly.
Okay.
Any inactive admin accounts should be disabled or removed. Okay? You also want to make sure that there aren't any SPNs registered against those personal admin accounts.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah. And then you need to look closely at any service accounts that happen to be in those privileged admin groups.
Okay.
Ideally, you should use the protected users group.
Protected users group. Okay, what's that?
It provides extra security for high privilege accounts.
Okay.
Prevents things like Kerberos delegation and enforces stronger authentication.
Okay.
But you need to be at least at Windows Server 2012 R2 domain functional level to use it.
Got it.
But the goal here is really to prevent Kerberos delegation for these critical accounts.
Okay, so essentially we're trying to lock down these admin accounts as much as possible.
As much as possible, yeah.
Right. Because if they're compromised, that's game over.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so what about the default privileged AD groups themselves.
Yeah, you need to analyze the membership of all those default groups.
Administrators, domain admins, all that.
Yep, all of those. Enterprise admins, schema admins, server operators, account operators. Make sure the members align with the principle of least privilege.
Okay.
And, understand what each of those groups can actually do.
Okay.
For example, the server operators group has a lot of power on DCs.
Okay.
And the account operators group should be empty.
Okay.
And then also be careful about any custom groups that might have too many privileges.
Okay.
Like maybe a VMware admins group that was given too much power in AD.
Got it. So you're saying don't just assume that the defaults are okay.
Exactly. You need to go in and look at each group and understand what it can do and who's in it.
And make sure that it's all locked down as much as possible.
Absolutely.
Okay. So now what about this Care BTGT account? I've heard that one's pretty important.
It is, yeah.
Why is it so important?
So the Care BTGG account is used for encrypting and signing all the Kerberos granting tickets in the domain.
Okay.
Which means it's really, really important for Kerberos authentication. So you need to change its password at least twice a year.
Okay.
And remember, your backups contain that password.